This is a series showing that coffee was sitting inside the systems that made the American Revolution possible. Trade, taxes, supply chains, public conversation, consumer resistance, and ultimately, American identity. Welcome to Brewing the Revolution. Hello, I'm Dawn Kennedy. I'm the CEO of Convoy Road Coffee Roasters, and welcome to Brewing the Revolution. This is a history series about how coffee moved through trade routes, taxes, public houses, political resistance, and eventually became part of our American identity. Now, this is not about proving that coffee caused the revolution, because it didn't. However, coffee was sitting inside the systems that made our American Revolution possible. And for this first episode, I want to talk about how before coffee could become patriotic, coffee had to become available here in the colonies before we went through the American Revolution. So right now, if you think about it for 2 seconds, coffee is ubiquitous in American life. We don't even realize or think much about our cup of coffee because we get up and it's available at the store. We grind it, we brew it. We can make an iced cup of it. We can put it in our cup holder in the car, and we just take it with us everywhere. We actually don't pay much attention to coffee here in American life. And part of that is because it's just everywhere. It feels ordinary, but it did not become ordinary by accident. It is interesting to think about how coffee came to the Americas, and that was in the 1720s. Centuries after Europe had become sober. I did actually a previous prelude episode on the sobering of Europe and how coffee made it possible, along with tea, for people to be able to sit and think and hold conversations and remember things the next day because they weren't sloshed from morning to evening. And also how, people were able to start to think about whether or not the authority structure they were living under was working for them anymore. And there is a famous story in the 1600s about the king attempting to ban coffee houses as seats of sedition. But we're going to take this to the colonies. So this is in the 1720s. Some coffee plants came to Martinique in the Caribbean from the French king. There was a French naval officer who was in charge of safely getting those plants. One of them passed away. One of them survived. They rationed water, did everything to keep it alive. And what's so interesting is while food history, of course, has some debates and things, there are plants in the Caribbean that can still be traced back to that single little coffee plant that made it across the Atlantic from the French naval officer. That was in the 1720s. So by the 1760s, interestingly, coffee was becoming more readily available. So we did have trade in other things like sugars, spices, rum. There was a lot of trade going on, but with that Caribbean setup in the coffee industry, we were able to trade coffee through colonial ports and colonial trade routes without having to cross the Atlantic. Unlike the British East India Trading Company, which tea, of course, had to come across, and we'll talk about that again in another episode. But what was so fascinating is between 1760 and 1770, the advertising of coffee for sale in the colonies grew about 25%. And then by the mid 1770s, it grew another 60%. So the coffee trade was here. There were advertisements for sale. It was available in the shops, and it was available also in the taverns, and it was available in the coffee houses, and it was available for people to drink at home. And so it started to become another choice. We didn't have to choose tea. Coffee was here and coffee was available. So one of the other kind of interesting facts, and I do have notes here because I don't want to miss anything, but one of the biggest things about, coffee becoming a habit or becoming part of daily life is it enters into our social infrastructure. People would choose it for hospitality, for business, for having conversations. Reading newspapers became important with your cup of coffee in the morning. And so the information that was able to be, spread through the colonies and the people sober enough to read the pamphlets and read the newspapers and to hold those thoughts and ideas basically at some point they get to stop and say, wait, are we going to keep doing this? And that is basically the beginnings of the American Revolution, is people were able to sit and think, and they were able to enjoy something other than coffee or other than tea. And that is why this becomes so important when we get to the American Revolution, and the fact that tea wasn't a bad drink. It just ended up having a political opinion that the colonists and the patriots didn't agree with. So we'll get into that in the next episode. So thank you for joining us for episode 1, Brewing the Revolution. And if this just made you think a little differently about your cup of coffee this morning, that's the entire point. We'll see you in the next episode.